From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there. Welcome to the show. It's Chicago Newsroom on Can TV, and I'm Ken Davis. So we're in it now, right? The people who run government here in Illinois are finally debating how they're going to get us out of this massive debt, and they've started by taking up all of our new governor's ideas. That was the easy part. They voted. No. They rejected changing workers' compensation, which the governor said would save some money. They rejected setting up little islands of union-free zones, which the governor said would create jobs, lots of jobs. And today they're about to say no to the governor's idea there should be a freeze on property tax increases. Now that one's especially ironic given the fact that the governor also favors taking back about half of the money that the state has traditionally shared with cities and towns and counties all over the state to help him balance his own out-of-whack books. So Chicago gets hundreds of millions of dollars in cuts to transportation and other funds, and then it's forbidden to raise its own taxes to make up for what the governor's taken away. Get that? Okay, but remember, this is all being done to create jobs. And the mayor's in it now up to his neck too. He's signing the papers on hundreds and hundreds of millions in new borrowing just to kind of refinance some of the horrendously bad debt and deals that the city made years ago. And he says a casino is going to shovel enough money into the city to support pensions for firefighters and cops, but that seems doubtful at best. On today's show, are there solutions that nobody's considering? One of our favorite guests here on Chicago Newsroom is Ralph Martire from the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. And Ralph's been in the news lately because some of his ideas and some of the studies his group has done have been getting attention from some influential people. And we're glad to have him back on the show to help us explain some of those influential friends and what they're talking about. Ralph, glad to have you back here. Always good to have you at the table to help us work our way through all
Always happy to be on the program, Ken. Where do you want to start?
You're a good explainer, so let's have you explain what's going on right now. Let's talk about Springfield, okay? I'm sorry, not Springfield. Let's talk about Rahm Emanuel and here in Chicago, because Rahm Emanuel yesterday signed a bunch of papers to sort of refinance the mortgage, kind of like, right?
Well, he had to. I mean, a number of the debt instruments that the city got into in the early 2000s under Mayor Daley were variable rate debt instruments that were supported by letters of credit issued by banks that basically said if your bond rating status dips below a certain level into junk area, then
which would never happen.
Which would have never happened, but did happen. And once that happens, it triggers a call on the letter of credit. So the letter of credit gets funded, the bondholders get paid, and the city then has to reimburse the banks. So that's what's going on. The city is in a financial crunch because of these variable rate deals that entered into in the early 2000s, and they have to pay the money.
This is kind of a highfalutin version of what happened to hundreds of thousands of homeowners a few years ago,
sure.
Right? Kind of in these bad instruments, and then it
collapsed. And at the time, everyone was saying, why doesn't the city take advantage of these things? You could lower your current interest rates. It's very funny the short memory talking heads have about the positions that they encouraged the city to take. And so at the time, it was very much supported by the private sector, saying you're going to save taxpayer money. And no one ever believed the city of Chicago would drop the junk bond status. Well, reality is a brutal thing. The future is very hard to predict. Or we'd all be buying lottery tickets. And so net, the city entered into these transactions. Its bond rating went down, and bond rating went down for good reasons. I mean, there never has been a rational plan at the city level to deal with its unfunded liability, particularly in its police and fire pension systems. And these are very significant. In fact, the city's unfunded liability for its police and fire pension systems is actually harder to resolve than the state's unfunded liability, even though the numbers are very different and smaller at the city level in an absolute sense. It's a much bigger problem for a number of reasons. And the first and foremost is City of Chicago has far fewer revenue tools in the kit to resolve its unfunded liability than the state does. The state has far broader taxing authority and can do many more things. So the city is looking at a very significant crunch on its revenues. Now everyone now knows that the balloon payment due this year on the pension systems is north of $550 million more than what what went to the pension systems last year. When you consider the city of Chicago's general operating budget is only about $3.2 billion, that's finding another $550 million just out of the blue is a significant challenge, especially when the city's running a deficit north of $300 million already. So the revenue crunch, the problem is $800 million, $850 million approaching $1 billion. That's not something that they could resolve facilely. I think the unfortunate aspect of this problem is that the city's known about it, and certainly Mayor Emanuel's known about it since he's taken office. This bump in funding is part of a 2010 law.
Yeah.
So it's been on the books since he's been a mayor. And no steps have been taken, incremental steps, to get the taxpayers used to paying a little bit more to fund these obligations.
Of course, the irony is that the mayor is, I mean, I don't know how long this was actually in the works to set the groundwork for this, but the mayor finally pulls the trigger on this refinancing yesterday, I guess it was, and everybody, of course, is clucking, well, if you had done this a year ago or 15 months ago, you would have saved, according to the Tribune, almost $70 million, because that's how much more money we have to give to the banks as a penalty for having the low debt rating, or the credit rating.
Right, but in a way that's not an entirely fair criticism of the Emanuel administration, because a significant driving cause of the refinancing deals now is the call being made, because they dipped down to junk status. And I'm assuming that the Emanuel administration was hoping to avoid getting that label, and so it was not irrational for them to say, let's see if we can't get our finances in order before dealing with that.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think you could imagine yourself being the mayor and thinking, I've got all of these other dragons to slay. I can let this one stay in the background for a bit longer, and then suddenly that dragon becomes the one that, you know. So specifically, the mayor has these two huge pension issues that he's got to deal with: the police and fire. And they're going to gobble up a lot of money, and he has to come up with a plan like a year ago and hasn't got it yet. But the plan seems to be now to try to get permission to once again push all of these payments off another 5 or 10 years, or at least spread them out and make the ramp a little lower, and get a casino and hope that the casino revenue will pay for both of these pensions.
All right, so there's some good and bad news in what the mayor is trying to do, and we can't really comment on the refinancing ramp piece other than to say if it's designed the right way, it should be part of his program. And yes, it has to be extended out a few more years.
You're not in principle then opposed to the idea of extending the ramp?
No, in fact, we'd want to eliminate the ramp, though. I mean, so there's sort of where we differ. If you're going to have a ramp at all, it has to be very short term, 2 or 3 years to get to a level dollar. And then that level dollar has to be consistently funded, and it needs to be a mandatory payment that they can't cheat. Now that could extend beyond the current payment period, because frankly the significant size of the debt load the city's carrying toward its pension systems is going to require the refinancing to go out a few more years. But as long as it's a rational repayment plan that accomplishes the following couple of things, then it could be a very good piece of the restructure. And so the Emanuel administration would be pursuing something that's rational, good public policy. So what it would have to accomplish: the ramp has to be very short. You have to get to this level dollar amount. The level dollar amount has to be set so that it is sufficient to, number one, grow the funded ratio of the systems every single year. It's got to grow that funded ratio while accounting for the system's obligations to pay benefits to both current and future retirees during the payment period. And it has to grow that funded ratio significantly enough so that the systems get healthy sometime in the next, pick a period of time, 40 to 50 years. And healthy would be 80% funded according to the Congressional Budget Office. So if they pick a funding plan that does that, that would be good public policy. Now here's the bad news on that. We've run some tentative numbers on this, and we haven't vetted these yet, so these can still change. But we think that the level dollar amount needed to get these systems to healthy is north of $450 million a year, very close to this $550 million figure. So they need significant revenue. and they need to have a rational plan for getting to that revenue, and then the payment obligation has to be absolute with no ability for future administrations to renege on it.
Okay, but I have to ask you, talking about this ramp of getting to the 450 million, are you talking 10 years, 6 years,
Oh no,
a year?
2 to 3. I mean,
2 to 3 years.
Yeah.
So in other words, it's pretty much what the plan is now, because they're talking about it starting next year.
Yeah, the problem with the plan now is it doesn't just ramp up next year, then ramps up the year after that and the year after that. It's one of these ski slope looking repayment plans. Well, you're never going to fund that.
Right.
And it's irrational to think you will, and tax systems don't operate that way,
That's a very
particularly at the
important
municipal
point.
level.
Yeah.
So what you have to have is a more rational repayment plan. This is something we've argued for at the state level even, and interesting, the Supreme Court echoed our argument in their decision ruling last year Senate Bill 1 unconstitutional. They basically pointed to CTBA's analysis and said, yeah, that's something the state needs to do.
Right.
It's something the city needs to do. So then, how do you get the revenue? And really, once again, the tools.
Can I just, I'm sorry, I apologize for interrupting. These things are.
You're very happy to interrupt.
I'm happy to interrupt. So when you get to this level, you're gonna see these essentially the same level of payments for 30, 40 years?
Yeah. Which
so
is
it
great.
really is kind of more like a mortgage then.
More like a mortgage, and if you think about it, because it's no longer ramping up, because it's flat, after inflation in real terms, it becomes a diminishing obligation.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to get to in the first 2 to 3 or 4 years, and probably very difficult to fund for 4 or 5 or 6. By year 7, 8, or 9,
it starts to.
and really down the road, it becomes something that the fiscal system can handle, provided it has adequate revenue to cover it. And so where are you going to get the
And
revenue
don't you wish
from?
they had done that in like 1973 or something?
Well, yeah, or actually have a funding plan set into law that followed actuarial principles and dealt with normal cost in a rational way, but they didn't. So that leaves us where we are today. And I know the mayor has put on the table gaming expansion and has offered to earmark all that revenue to the pension systems. And once again, if you're going to have gaming expansion, then I think a very rational thing to do with whatever revenue you get from that is to earmark it to your pension system. So, if it's going to happen,
you agree with that?
No problem with that happening. But it's a big if. You don't know if it's going to happen. And if it does happen, let's say it passes miraculously before May 31 of this year, where I don't see a lot happening in Springfield before May 31, but say that it does. How long is it going to take to start actually generating revenue and ramping up? You're at least
I would say
24
probably
months
about
away.
24 hours, because all the big hotels are saying, hey, we'd turn one of our ballrooms over to this. We could get the machines in there. We could do this in a month.
I'm thinking you're looking at 2-year lag. So once again, getting to that point where you have, and then how much revenue you're going to have, and you're probably not going to have 480 million from this, right?
Well, that's the real issue, isn't it? Is I mean, no one can predict this, but common sense would seem to tell you that you have, I mean, there are casinos everywhere now, within a few minutes drive of your house if you live in Chicago. So having a great big one down at McCormick Place is not going to necessarily be a big attraction to Chicagoans. It might attract a lot of conventioneers and that kind of thing, but that market is dropping too. So I just don't quite see how it becomes this great savior, this fiscal savior.
Which means whatever it's going to generate, and that will be to the plus. But in the interim, you need a solid revenue strategy to start ramping up to this level dollar amount. And then when if the casinos come online, you could reduce your current tax levies that have gone to fund the pensions to accommodate this new money coming in from the casinos, or divert that revenue to funding current services, whatever you feel is more appropriate. And I think the only 2 tools in the kit that really could generate adequate revenue to fund the pensions for the city are the property tax combined with an expansion of the sales tax base to include consumer services. If the state did that latter step, if it expanded the sales tax base to consumer services, that would generate $300 million for the city of Chicago. And that's significant revenue.
That's real money.
And that's a big step towards meeting this obligation. And then you figure another 180 to 200 million from the property tax, and that levy could actually be temporary until the gaming revenue comes online, and then modified to go with that. But you need to be honest enough with taxpayers for them to understand that these 2 revenue pieces have to be on the table now.
You have to assume that the taxpayers are adult enough that they can actually understand this stuff, which, I don't know, maybe that's a big stretch. I don't know if it is or not. But hold on to that thought about the expanded sales tax for just a second, because I just want to sort of tie a bow on this thing about the pension plans, we don't tend to think, you're absolutely right, very much about the fire and police pensions. They're kind of like they're like the third or fourth or fifth car in the train when we talk about pension obligations, because everybody thinks about teachers first. It's like the CTU and the $1 billion hole at CPS. Nothing you're talking about here even begins to nibble at that problem, right?
Correct.
So that's a whole separate bunch of new taxes or something that we have to deal with.
Yeah, I think when you look at CTU, and the Chicago Teacher Pension Fund, two things have to be understood about it. Number one, when the city of Chicago got control over the pension fund from the state as part of the deal for giving Mayor Daley control of the board.
Oh, that day, yes.
The pension systems were 90 to 100% funded.
We've
and in
mentioned that
fact,
many times.
they got north of 100% funded in the early 2000s, and then the intentional policy decision was made to simply stop funding them. So literally the contribution from CPS, from the city into the pension, went down to zero, flattened out, and then
By law.
And then they magically got an unfunded liability. I don't know why this surprised anyone.
Yeah.
It was an intentional policy decision, had to end up
Yeah.
there. So I think that someone needs to step to the plate and say that was a bad decision and now we need to make amends for that and fix it. But I think second, if you look at one of the driving reasons policymakers made that decision was to put more money into current operations, i.e. funding the delivery of education to
Right.
children in the city of Chicago. And the reason they were looking for new revenue to do that is the state was dropping the ball on funding schools.
Excellent
so
point.
a real reason that contributed to the decision makers underfunding their pensions was the lack of adequate financing
Right.
from the state for education.
So
So
here's this tree just laden with low-hanging fruit. Let's
Yeah.
go pick it.
yeah. So net, you can't resolve Chicago's unfunded pension liability for its teachers without the state really stepping to the plate with enhanced revenue and enhanced investments, and the state should, because the state is very much complicit in the policy decision to underfund the pensions by its underfunding of operational costs for schools.
But just because the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability says you should do this doesn't mean they're going to do it. Do you seriously think the state
Generally,
is
it means they won't do it, actually.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
judging from the reactions
Do
we
you
get in Springfield.
seriously think the state of Illinois at this particular time is going to say, oh yes, and while we're at it, let's make sure that we help adequately fund the pensions at the Chicago Public Schools?
Well, I think that there's a chance that could happen because there are some adults in Springfield that get that the state really is somewhat culpable for the unfunded liability in the pension at the city of Chicago, even though when the state devolved the responsibility for those pension systems to the city, they were very well funded, 90 to 95% funded. But you know, Senate President Cullerton has made it very clear that the state has skin in that game and should have skin in that game. And I think, while I don't necessarily agree with everything he's put on the table, he's been very focused on that and fairly focused on that, trying to find a good resolution. I know that the chair of Senate Revenue, Toy Hutchinson, concerned about that, concerned about adequately funding schools, concerned about having an adequate revenue base to fund all the core services the state provides and have the state meet its obligations in a responsible way. I mean, so you have a number of people, I can name others, Representative Will Davis, Representative Al Riley, you have State Senator Kim Lightford. So I know a lot of people in Springfield get bad names for running away from it. And I think it's time to call out some of the people in Springfield that have really been working hard to resolve the problem and have
put some
frankly,
positive energy in it.
Yeah, and frankly have gone very public and said we need to take these steps. Senator Heather Staines has said a number of these things. And so net, we do have some true leadership in Springfield on very difficult issues. It's just getting enough support politically to get that boulder up the hill.
So that's where we're at with the pensions and with Springfield. But you have suggested, the center has suggested through a couple of studies, that there are things that we haven't really looked at carefully enough. And one of them you've already touched on is the expansion of the state sales tax to tax certain kinds of underlined and emphasis added consumer services. So if I get my hair cut, I should pay tax on that. But if it's a business to business kind of transaction, then that shouldn't be taxed because it adds an extra layer of tax and ends up paying a lot more, if I understand it correctly. What are the chances of that becoming reality?
I think actually there's a very significant chance that an expansion of the sales tax base will be part of a final budget deal in some form or another. Even Governor Rauner, when he was candidate Rauner, put on the table an expansion of the sales tax base to include some services, and so he recognized it, and I think he correctly described it at that time as an important step toward modernization of the tax code, which is precisely what it would be. Second, you can't ignore the largest and fastest growing segment of the Illinois economy with your tax system and expect that your revenue will be adequate to balance your budget from year to year. And that's precisely what our current tax policy on the sales tax does. So our sales tax of the 45 states with a sales tax is 45th most narrow. We only include 5 class categories of services. There are 168.
I didn't know there were any until I read your report.
There's 168 you could go after. We go after 5, and that would be 45th in the nation. And what we focus our sales tax is pretty much the sale of products, hard physical things you could touch, this notepad, a pen, ties, etc. That doesn't work because right now in our economy, the sale of products is only roughly 17% of all economic activity.
Really
that's what we tax.
That's such an interesting thing. Yeah.
And what we don't tax is services are 72% of the economy.
We're a service economy.
We're a service economy.
We sell each other burgers.
But I think you made a point that I would like to emphasize. It's not like you want to tax every service because you could create huge distortions. You can harm your economy if you do tax policy wrong. Business to business transactions. These should be exempt from a sales tax because they are not a final disposition of an economic transaction to its end user, right? And if you tax every interim step as a product or service is being developed as it moves through your state economy, think about it. You tax it from business A to business B. Well, then business B includes that tax in its price to business C.
Somebody sells
and then
you
you
the
tax
steel
it again,
or
right?
the raw materials.
So you're putting
to
a
make it.
tax on a tax on a tax on a tax. You're artificially inflating the cost of a product or service, and the end user, the consumer, ends up paying most, if not all of it anyway, as it gets added into the pricing structure. And we ran a simple example of it, something that should result a high-ticket item in maybe $20 worth of taxes paid by the end user consumer. If you taxed every business-to-business transaction, would cost 3 times that, $62 in taxes to the end user. So you're costing the consumer a lot more, and you're doing it in a very inefficient and non-transparent fashion. So literally haircuts, lawn care, bowling, health clubs, auto repair, final end user consumer services.
But the important thing, I just completely forgot the thing I was going to ask you, but anyway, let's services, taxes, anyway. One of the things I've always wanted to ask you about, we've never had time, and I'm going to reserve 2 minutes of it right now, is this discussion about the transaction tax. Everybody talks about it, but it always just ends up kind of like with, well, that couldn't happen, and then that's the end of it.
Good, and it should end right there, because it's not going to happen. It's
on
got no political viability whatsoever. It'd be very difficult to enforce. It'd be great policy at the federal level, and the federal government really ought to look at that. But Illinois simply won't ever adopt a financial transactions tax. And so if a lot of time and effort is spent advocating for something that really doesn't have a political chance, you're diverting attention from the primary areas people should devote their time and efforts to, and that are the main taxes that feed state governments across the nation, your income and sales tax. And our income and sales tax policy are very poor. And if we fixed them, if we just modernized them, if we made them work in the current economy, we would have no need to even discuss a financial transactions tax. And so why don't we deal with the basic tools and focus attention there, and it also has far more political viability, and not distract people with a discussion that, while I admit a financial transaction tax would be very good at the federal level, it would make no sense at the state level.
But isn't a financial transaction tax just another service tax? It's just a service, right? I sell you some stocks or some bonds.
It could be, but here's the thing. No other state has one.
Oh.
None.
Oh.
New York,
I wonder why that is.
Technically has one, and they take it out and refund it right back. And to think that Illinois will somehow, some way, magically become a tax outlier on overtaxing businesses when Illinois has historically been a very significant tax outlier on undertaxing. I think is not a rational way to look at the world.
The comedy half hour here. You're a pretty funny guy. Yeah. So where we're at right now, with all of the things that we're facing, you seem to be optimistic that it would be possible to come up with a rational way of funding our way out of this over a period of years.
Yep.
You think it can be done?
We've run the numbers. The math works. It's just a political will to make the tax policy reforms and the re-amortization of the pension debt law.
And more people seem to be paying attention to you. I mean, not that people haven't in the past, but I mean, you seem to be sort of flying in those high circles, talking to the people who make these policies. Do you think some of this is going to happen?
I do, because there's really no other options that are sustainable. And I think there are a number of elected officials that are very tired of going from crisis to crisis. Mm-hmm. And that's no way to govern. Mm-hmm. And it's really no way to make investments. In fact, you even had Tim Newdig, the chairman or the head of the Office of Management and Budget for the governor, basically saying, no, what we're cutting isn't waste, fraud, and abuse. We're cutting needed program. We just don't have the revenue to fund it. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a message.
Yeah.
And the message is, every cut we make now is by definition poor public policy and harmful to our state.
Yeah. And I mean, you have no less than the Supreme Court essentially saying what we have here is a revenue problem. I mean, they said the same thing. It's so people who you don't consider to be wild-eyed tax and spend liberals are saying the same thing. It's like we've got to.
Although, can we talk about that phrase, tax and spend liberal? If you tax and spend on police coverage, are you liberal? I love the phrase because it is so misleading. If you tax and spend, you are neither liberal nor conservative. You are responsible. What you are saying is this public service.
You want an answer? You want an answer to that?
No, I don't. I want to go on my own here. When you tax to spend as a politician, you're making the case to the public that this is such an important investment. You should be willing to pay your income in taxes to cover it.
Right.
Illinois has not taxed and spent over the years. It has borrowed.
It's been a low spending state and a low taxing state.
And borrowed to spend.
Right.
Beyond what its low taxes would support.
Borrowing is revenue, isn't it?
Yeah, so if you borrow to spend, you are irresponsible. Mm-hmm. And that's the habit we need to break. And you can't break that habit unless you fix your tax policy. So I really love getting to some of these nice rhetorical spins because I think they mislead the public greatly from the reality of fiscal policy.
If you tax and spend for military and possibly on a local level police, that's not liberalism. If you tax and spend for human services of various kinds, then you're just a tax and spend liberal. That's
really,
the answer to your question.
So providing mental health services is a liberal thing. And one of the leaders in advocating for mental health service investment was former Republican Lee Daniels. So I just don't see a lot of these services as liberal.
Snarky.
I know.
It's not, but
I try to have this discussion on tax policy because 9 out of $10 spent at the state level, 4 things: education, health, social services, and public safety.
The big 4, right?
The big 4.
Oh, Ralph, we could go on for hours. I just really enjoy talking to you, and I hope people listen to this guy. Really, listen to the CTVA. They have some good things to say. Thank you so much for being with us once again. Sorry we ran out of time.
Thanks for having me on the program.
All right. You have been watching Chicago Newsroom, a community service of CAN TV. You can find us here on cable, but anytime you want, you go to this address and you can watch us online. You can listen to us on iTunes. You can have us with you anytime you want. What a thought that is, huh? See you next week. We'll be back with another show. Thanks. Bye-bye.